welcome. And if you haven't been on our webinars before, or maybe if you have on some of the older style ones, what we're starting now is a new series of just 20-minute sessions. I know you're all really busy people. What we'd like to do is just to share a few tips in as short a time as possible so you can get back to work. No fluff, anything like that. So it's going to be a 20-minute presentation. I will stop bang on 20 past 10, and then I'll hang on for any questions if people have got lots of questions. I'd suggest if you have questions, do type them into the question box as we go, and then at the end, I'll come back and answer the questions. Okay, so the topic today is warehouse capacity and productivity. Why are we talking about that? Because it's probably one of the biggest issues that we see across our consulting clients at the moment. For the last couple of years, probably everybody has been running out of space. They've been trying to rent new warehouses, and it's become extremely difficult to operate. So it's a big issue. Now, just as we get underway, as I mentioned, there'll be some questions right at the end after 20 minutes. Do put your questions into the question box. If we are not connected on LinkedIn, take 2 seconds now, scan that QR code and we can connect. We share lots of great stuff on LinkedIn as well. Okay, let's just start off with thinking about where you are now. So I'm going to be sort of scribbling on this, and you should have a workbook that you can follow along and make some notes as well. Do make sure that you've got that. If we look at the situation now with your warehousing and your capacity issues, if we don't do anything, if we're not going to do anything about that, what sort of stuff is going to happen? We're going to see definitely an increase in costs, and I'm going to go through some of the causes of this. The cost increases come about through needing additional storage, through inefficiencies in the warehouse, labor inefficiencies, and so on. We're going to see service actually decline. And again, that can be because of clutter in the warehouse, not being able to get to products, poor DIFOT coming out of the warehouse. And basically, you really just get a lack of traction in moving forward with any kind of improvement options. What about if we start to look at the warehouse and start to address some of those issues? And I'll just share some figures here from consulting work that we've done over the last few years. What we see is, in terms of capacity, if you address some of these issues and utilize some of the tips that I'm going to be sharing in a moment, we can see capacity actually increase anything from 15 to 20%. So if you're faced with capacity issues in your warehouse, and very often it's a case of we need a bigger warehouse, we've got to go out and rent more space, some of these techniques that I'm going to show you could help you actually avoid that. In terms of labor efficiency, and I know we're talking predominantly about capacity here, but there's a big knock-on effect to labor efficiency as well. We see an increase of about 4 to 7% there. And what about service? Because a cluttered warehouse is not going to be offering a very good service level. And there we can see probably 5 to 8% increase in service. So there's lots and lots of very good reasons to try and address any capacity issues that you might have. Oh, great question coming in there, keep them coming. Great incentives to try and improve and get things working better. So what we're going to go through is some of the symptoms, and I'd like you to have a think about your own warehouses as we go through this, and some of the symptoms that you've got about poor issues around capacity. We're going to talk about some of the common causes, because obviously if we can address some of those causes, we can avoid the issue. And then we're going to talk about some of the solutions. I'm going to talk about short-term solutions as well as longer-term solutions. So believe it or not, I have seen warehouses like this. Hopefully yours does not look like this. I was in Melbourne a few months ago and saw, this is not it, but I saw a warehouse that looked exactly like that. So it kind of begs the question, when is a warehouse too full? And I've got a simple graph here which kind of illustrates this in terms of capacity. And non-logistics people sometimes don't get their heads around this. They think, you know, if I've got a 10,000 pallet warehouse, I should be able to store 10,000 pallets. Not true, because we actually need operating space, we need space for receipting, dispatching. You can't fill all of the spots. Think of it like a multi-story car park. You've got 10,000 parking spots in the car park. If all the spots were full, it's absolutely gridlocked. You know, sometimes it is, isn't it? You're driving round and round in circles trying to find a parking spot. A warehouse is a little bit like that. So what's the optimum level? I tend to work on the basis of about 85% of the slots being filled as being optimum. It kind of depends a little bit on the storage media that you're using, but as you start to go above that 80%, and I have seen a warehouse that had 110% occupancy, you can imagine all the aisles were filled with product. As we start to go above that 85%, so our productivity falls. So it's a big issue in terms of warehouse productivity and cost. So what are some of the symptoms that we might see that we've got a warehouse operating at peak capacity or, you know, really impacting our operation? We see the aisles clogged up. You know, that is a really common one. You're going to have to excuse my scribble. We see labor costs going up. And why is that? It can be because we're having difficulty actually moving around the facility, finding product and so on. A key one is off-site storage. That's going to be costing more. And things like receipting and container unloading, containers waiting. You know, these are all symptoms of a clogged warehouse, inefficiency and increasing cost. So what do you think some of the causes of this might be? Some of them are probably obvious and some might not be quite so obvious. So some common causes of that, which we're going to walk through very briefly: SLOBX, slow, obsolete and excess stock, particularly the excess stock. I can't think of a warehouse that I've looked at recently that hasn't had a real problem around SLOBX. So that is certainly something to address. Poor forecasting. And why would you say that is an issue in clogging up the warehouse? Because if we're not getting the forecasting right, we're not getting our SKU range balanced correctly within that warehouse, and we can end up with a lot of slow moving stock. So poor forecasting tends to impact this SLOBX issue as well. Kind of related to those is our purchasing policies, and it could be you know, minimum order quantities, order frequencies, and so on from our suppliers. If that's really lumpy, if that's not done in a smart fashion, it's going to increase the inventory in our warehouse, and so clog up the warehouse, perhaps with inventory that shouldn't actually be there. And one of the things that I see people get wrong a lot of the time is planning for growth. So if you're thinking you need to move to a new warehouse, you're establishing a new warehouse, you need to have a really good handle of the life that you expect to get out of that warehouse. And over the years, probably 50% of the companies that we've worked with struggle sometimes to understand what that growth might be over the next 5 to 10 years. And I totally get it. Sometimes it can be really difficult, but you've got to be building or leasing that warehouse with enough capacity going into the future, probably 5 years as an absolute minimum. So some of the common causes there, I'm sure you could come up with a whole bunch more yourself, but those are some of the really frequent ones that we see. So what about some of the simple fixes? I'm going to add in one that maybe some of you know and have tried, and that is slotting. What is slotting? I'll show you a very brief example of that. I always suggest that it's a little bit like putting products in your fridge. You put foodstuffs in your fridge so that it's convenient to get to them. You know, if you open our fridge, what will be in the door? It will be the milk and the eggs and the butter and things like that that you go to frequently. Slotting is a process where you can do that with all of your products in the warehouse and get all of your most frequently used products, most frequently picked products down near the dispatch area, and the least, lowest velocity products, if you like, down towards the back of the warehouse. Doing that can actually improve productivity by about 15%. and it actually has an impact on capacity as well. So do think about slotting. What about aisle widths? I'll show you an example in a moment where just simple changing of aisle widths, it doesn't sound that simple, but with different equipment, you can maybe get another 30% capacity. And I'll show you a diagram of that. And we've talked about inventory already. Cut inventory, you know, it's the SLOBX. Clear out, that's really slow moving and obsolete stock. So there's some really sort of short-term fixes that we'll have a look at here and now in a bit more detail. Slotting, if you haven't come across it, here's a very simple example where on the left, imagine this is our A lines. This represents 80% of the products being picked, and on the left they're all over the warehouse. And so we've got people, you know, traveling up and down the warehouse picking product. Walking for miles a day picking product was very, very inefficient. It's also quite poor use of the actual picking slots, the capacity, the cubic capacity of those slots. When you've actually gone through a slotting process in a warehouse and you move all of those faster moving products down towards dispatch, you get much better utilization of the actual pick slots. You reduce all of that travel and you end up with a much more efficient warehouse. One thing you've got to be very careful of though, imagine we've got, you know, some of these pens, this is a silver one and there's black ones and yellow ones, whatever. If you've got lots of fast moving products that are similar, you don't want them next to each other. That can be confusion in terms of picking. Also, it can cause a little bit of congestion around the highest velocity products. So you've got to be careful how you do that, but there's some really good tools to take you through that. I mentioned aisle widths as one way of actually getting added capacity. I'm not sure whether many of you have seen articulated forklifts. This one is like a little bendy bus. It's articulated in the middle. It's one way to actually get more capacity into your warehouse. So an example was there was a smaller warehouse, probably about 5,000 pallets. A client of ours was struggling for capacity, and we worked out the sort of cost benefit of changing their MHE to these articulated forklifts because they can operate in a much narrower aisle. And what they were able to do was to come into the warehouse. Imagine we've got the warehouse here with the lines of racking, and each weekend they'd come in and they'd shuffle the racks down, 2 or 3 racks, take the product out, move the racks, put the product back, and they do 2 or 3 lines of racking, rows of racking each weekend. And you know, over a couple of months they had it all rearranged with much narrower aisles, and they got 30% more capacity into the warehouse. So a really a relatively easy solution. I mean, obviously they have to come in and move the racking. We've talked about excess inventory. Let me just highlight this one to you, and this is a sanitized real life example. Here we've got a chart showing excess and obsolete stock within a particular business. Here we've got our sort of okay stock, right levels of cover, and here we've got excess inventory. We've got almost $10 million of inventory. When we start looking at how much cover we've got across the inventory, and we've got our A, B, and C lines across here, if we look at these, we've got 24 months cover of some A's and C's in there. We've got 12 to 24 months of cover of some A's and B's and C's. So you've really got to understand your inventory in a much greater level of detail to understand the impact it's having on the warehouse capacity. So looking at the inventory in that way is always a really worthwhile thing to do. So that's a couple of sort of short-term measures. What about some of the longer-term fix? It's really about maximizing the cube. And if you haven't come across that term before, it's not just about trying to utilize every single pallet space in the warehouse. It's making sure that we're using the footprint and the height as well, and also the density of storage within the warehouse. So we've really got to look out for that. Look at height, and we'll look at a couple of examples of how we can better utilize height. And look at the flow and the speed of product going through your warehouse. If you can actually accelerate the velocity of product going through a warehouse, it's in the warehouse less time, and therefore it's taking up less capacity. So we'll have a look at a couple of examples of that. People always ask, what about automation? Does that help? It can help. This very simple diagram is showing the number of SKUs that we've got in a warehouse compared with the sort of volume of products going through. And the higher volume, the more SKUs you've got, it can lend itself a little bit more towards automation. So particularly relevant here, we've got things like shuttle racking, high density racking, and so on. Here's a very simple technique that a lot of people use, just mezzanine floors. Depends very much on the industry. I'm hesitating a little bit there because the picking can be a little bit slower. Great for small items, small parts. You can be picking up on the top level as well as the lower level, and great use of height. We're not limiting our picking to just 2 meters in height down on the bottom there, so that can be very effective. I've seen these used to great effect. You might think these are all carousels. This is referred to more as a vertical lift machine. Doesn't quite operate like a carousel. It's bringing bins out and down to be picked and then taking them up. The carousel on the right tends to sort of rotate around, but they can be really good for getting much higher density of storage into a warehouse on a very small footprint, so always worth considering. In reality, larger warehouses particularly tend to be very much a hybrid. And in this example, we've actually got some automated picking lanes here. We've got standard racking here. If you look at any of the big grocery warehouses, they tend to be a little bit like this, a bit hybrid with all different types of storage media. But if you're looking, this is just a simple example of a warehouse. If you're looking at a simpler layout, a more generic layout, remember we're looking at things like the aisle widths. We're looking at spaces where we can maybe put slower moving items. They put racking along the wall. We've got that use of mezzanine here to maximize the cube, utilize that headspace for picking and so on. And just another example there. One of the things that you also need to look at, and I'm going to move into sort of labor efficiencies here just for a moment, is to look at the peak periods for activities like receiving, put away, picking and dispatching, particularly receiving and dispatching, I would say. And these box charts are a really useful way of looking at the activity across the week and trying to balance the workload across the week. That's going to have a great impact as well. And just another view of labor costs within warehousing. This is a useful thing to have a look at, not directly related to capacity, but certainly worth knowing about. What we've found is a bit of a general rule of thumb over the years that to the right of this yellow line is about 60% of your warehouse labor cost. And so if you're trying to make your warehouse more efficient, particularly look at activities like receiving, put away, picking and packing, and try to get those as efficient as possible. Don't take that as gospel. It's a little bit like the Pareto rule, 80-20. We find about 60% of the labor cost is tied up in those sort of 4 activities. Okay, we have 1 minute to go. And what I would suggest is that you might want to pull out that to-do list on your workbook, jot down a couple of things that you might have a look at in your own warehouse, short-term or long-term. But basically, it comes down to getting these things right. Looking at the layout and flow, looking at the sort of equipment and technology in the warehouse, and then, of course, people, process and systems. But the key things that I would really look at are maximizing the cube, making sure you're using the height as well as the footprint, minimizing the inventory where you can, getting rid of all of that slobex, definitely slotting to get much better use of the storage capacity and to actually cut down travel time in the warehouse. So there we go. We finished on 20 minutes. Bit of a gallop through, but the aim was just to give you a few ideas to go away and have a look at your own warehouses if you've got warehouse capacity problems. A bit of a thank you for joining us today. If you haven't been on our webinars before, we do like to do this. So for everybody attending today, we've donated life-saving water to 50 people in Cambodia, and you'll get a certificate in the mail, in the email. And lastly, just while you're tapping in any questions that you have, some more resources there for you. You can jump onto our blog and our Supply Chain Secrets YouTube channel. Lots of videos and articles about the topics that we've been talking about here today. There we go. We finished in 20 minutes. I wasn't sure if that was going to work or not. Our next session coming up next month in September will be on outsourcing with Stephen Thacker. He'll be sharing lots of great tips around outsourcing. For those who want to hang on and ask questions, feel free to do so. But for the rest of you who I know are probably very busy, thank you for joining us for 20 minutes, and we'll see you next time.